Today, Android is the number one operating system for smartphones, but when Google launched the product in 2008, the iPhone already had a huge head start. Most consumers didn't know it existed, and even the tech press didn't take it super seriously. But JR Raphael was an early fan. A freelance tech journalist who wrote for publications like Fast Company and The Verge, JR pitched his editors at Computerworld on a regular column about Android, and though they were skeptical at first, they gave him the green light. As Android grew into a major mobile operating system and eventually overtook the iPhone, JR became one of the leading authorities on the product. In 2018, he launched Android Intelligence, a supplementary newsletter that mostly linked to his column and other news items. But as it picked up steam, he began to introduce more and more monetization features. By 2023, Android Intelligence was generating the majority of his annual income. In our interview, JR explained to me why he was such an early fan of Android, what motivated him to launch the newsletter, and how he turned it into a thriving business. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcast. One last thing, if you enjoy this sort of programming, you should definitely be subscribed to my newsletter. It's completely free to read and is 100% focused on making you a better media operator. Go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the word Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with JR. Hey JR, thanks for joining us.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're one of those traditional journalists who kind of slowly slipped into the creator economy, whereas like some journalists like make a very conscious jump and going into it full time. But this was something that just kind of, from what I gather, kind of slowly took over what you were doing. And I love it when that happens, when it's very natural. Let's start by hearing a little bit about your journalism background. Like you have over a decade's experience as like a tech journalist, right?
Yeah, gosh. That's crazy. But yes, that is correct. Well over a decade at this point. So my career initially started in broadcast journalism. I was a TV news producer for several years, did that, loved a lot of things about it, but was ready for a change, kind of inadvertently fell into writing about tech, doing stuff. Honestly, while I was looking for another job, I thought I was going to work in PR, wasn't really super enthusiastic about it. And then in what turned out to be a fateful twist, the job I was originally going to take with a nonprofit doing some PR stuff fell through before I started. It was a nonprofit and they lost funding. So that led me on a little journey of, maybe I'll try to do a little freelance writing while I look for my next job, my next real job, as I thought at the time. And, about 6 months or so after that, I suddenly had the realization, I guess this is my next real job. And that was back in, like 2008.
Yeah, and you never had a full-time job since. Like it's always been like you've had steady contracts where you were doing, steady work, but you've always like been self-employed since then.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been lucky in the fact that it's always felt like a full-time job. I've never been, and there's something exciting about that, and part of me would like to do that, but I've never been one who's just, my day is pitching stuff and doing random stories. I've always had very steady contract-based things. In the beginning, I wrote for a number of smaller sites and then started writing full-time. Well, I wouldn't say full-time, but a lot of my time spent writing for PC World, which led to writing for Computerworld, where the column that became Android Intelligence began and still exists. And so, yeah, I'm still doing a lot of writing for Computerworld, for Fast Company, here and there for The Verge. And most of it is very regular. I mean, I know going in, I'm writing X things per month, or I'm doing this per week, or what have you.
And so was it by accident that you started writing about gadgets, or was it something like, do you have like a tech enthusiasm background?
Yeah, it was just always something I was interested in. I've always kind of been a little bit of a gadget geek. As a kid, I ran a computer bulletin board system. I learned how to build computers. So it's always sort of been my own personal interest and passion. And in that phase where I didn't know what to do with myself when I was in between the careers and jobs, I thought, well, if there's anything I can write about, I guess it's technology. And so one thing just kind of led to another. And then right when I was getting started really wholeheartedly doing it as a full-time career, that's right around the time that Android was getting started. It was still just really a seed of an idea in Google at that point, but it was right in the infancy. And right away, I kind of connected with it and was interested in it and started writing about it. And so again, somewhat inadvertently, that kind of became my beat and my primary area of focus, which has remained all this time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not as familiar with the history as you, but based on what I've read, Android was a very rinky-dinky mobile operating system when it first launched. Obviously, iPhone basically invented the market and then dominated it for the first several years. And like nobody took Android seriously. I think it was originally going to be like almost like a BlackBerry type screen instead of a touch screen, right? And then once the iPhone came out, they realized that they needed to pull out all the stops and kind of pivot. And then it didn't have any market share to begin with. Obviously today it's a huge, especially globally, a huge dominant force, and I think even outpaces Apple in terms of the number of phones it's on. But when you were writing about it in those early days, what was that like? Was it hard to get editors to greenlight stories? Did it have much of an audience, since the community must have been pretty small, people who were actually enthusiastic about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to even fathom now because, like you said, it's the dominant global operating system globally, and has a large share in the U.S. too. But in those early days, it was really not much of anything. So it and iOS, well, I guess it wasn't called iOS, but it and the iPhone were pretty much being developed around the same time. The iPhone ended up coming out. Google, according to most of the reports from people who were there's a guy who's on the Android team who wrote a really detailed, interesting book about those early days. They were actually developing two devices simultaneously. One was the more BlackBerry one, and that's the one that's gotten a lot more attention. But then there was also a touch-oriented model. And once the iPhone came out, it became clear, like, okay, that's the path they're going on. But I mean, that being said, I mean, you look at any of that stuff from those early phone days, it was all pretty rough. Even those of us who are old enough to have used it, I think you forget every now and then it's fascinating to get out an old device and see just how rudimentary, I mean, on both sides, Android and iPhone, everything was back then. Yeah, early on, it was more than anything just sort of a project within Google, is I think how most people saw it. Not many people were taken seriously beyond that. And, to be fair, for good reason. Google has a bit of a track history of coming up with these ambitious ideas, working on them for whatever, a couple years, a few years, 5 years maybe, and then just pivoting, changing course, giving up. I mean, it's kind of become a bit of a punchline. And it's true. But in the early days, no one took it seriously as something that people were going to use. There was one device early on, the HTC G1 that came out, and also known, depending on where you looked, it was like the T-Mobile Dream, I think was the other name. It had a few different identities, but it didn't have many people using it. It was pretty rough. There wasn't much of an ecosystem around it. And of course, at that point, BlackBerry was the dominant player. Apple was just starting to get a lot of momentum and be seen as sort of the hot young up and comer. And so I wrote about it just sort of while I was writing general news and kind of column-y reaction sorts of coverage and analysis and that kind of thing. And after a while, I realized I was just really interested in it. And I started seeing these trends early on that you could see, yes, the numbers were small, but it was growing pretty consistently. And it would be really interesting. It was really interesting back then to point that out. And I wrote a lot of analysis pieces looking at, okay, just if we consider that it's growing at this rate, there are currently, at whatever point, maybe 2 Android phones in existence. We know there are like 10 more in development. You just do a little math. You're like, okay, if things keep going, this is really going to explode. And this was back when all websites still had comments, and I would just get ripped to pieces by people in the comments because people were, the smartphone stuff, especially back then, it's like a little bit of a religion. People are, well, then there were the BlackBerry people and the iPhone people and maybe a little bit of like the Windows Mobile, Windows Phone people, but there weren't many Android people. And so to dare say, at this rate, it's going to be outpacing all the other operating systems in X months or X years, people didn't take kindly to it. It was an interesting time. By the time I thought, this would be something cool to actually write a column on and make my primary focus, it was tough. Like you said, editors said to me, I don't think there's going to be enough there. There aren't enough people who want to read about it. You're not going to be able to write 2 or 3 things a week. There's not enough material. There's not enough momentum. And thankfully, one of the editors who was then in charge of the blogs and columns at Computerworld decided to take a chance. And she made it known. She said, look, I don't think it's going to work, but I know who you are. You've been writing at our sister site for a while. Let's give it a try. I don't think it'll work, but we'll try it. And to her credit, a few months later, she came around and became one of the biggest supporters of it. And it became pretty clear pretty fast that there was an appetite for it and a lot to talk about and a lot of people who wanted to hear about it.
But did you struggle at first to find things to write about, considering how small the developer community and the the customer base was at that time?
Honestly, no. I think then and still today, and I think this is probably just a common writer trait, I had and continue to have the fear that any day now I'm just going to completely run out of things to say in general. And it's been however many years and it hasn't happened yet. I think with Android in particular, even early on, there's always just been so much happening, for better and for worse, depending on your perspective in the moment. When you look at like the Apple ecosystem, it's one company making basically one phone, a few different models of the same phone, and one flavor of the operating system is all kind of streamlined in one thing. With Android, even fairly early, there were a lot of players, a lot of different devices, a lot of every phone maker putting on its own spin onto the software. So there's really never been a shortage of stuff to write about, despite the lingering fear I have that one day I'm going to run out of things to say.
And how did you end up launching a website specifically about Android?
So the column started at Computerworld in 2010. And it always had its own identity. I owned the brand, and it was just part of Computerworld, but also my own independent thing at the same time. So it was around 2018, before the newsletter boom had started. They weren't a cool thing. Substack didn't exist. People weren't making money off it. It wasn't considered a business at that point. But a friend of mine who writes about different areas of tech had been doing an email newsletter and was always telling me how great it was. That, he just really felt like he was connecting directly with readers. He was getting a great response. He was getting to control the whole thing, make it look, feel, everything the way he wants. So a little bit on a whim, I decided, okay, I'll give this a shot, and started the newsletter. Then there wasn't really much of a web presence around it at that point. It initially started with review, way before Twitter bought review, and so just kind of had a simple setup around that. And once again, with that, it was clear to me within a matter of weeks of doing it that there was something to it, that people were responding, that it was going somewhere. It was still just sort of like a on the side fun project or something to do in my spare time, theoretical spare time. Certainly didn't think it was going to really go anywhere or be like a big part of my job or a business or anything like that. But that was the beginning, and then it just continued to grow and grow from there.
Yeah, like a lot of journalists around that time, and maybe even a little earlier with Tiny Letter, were launching newsletters not to build businesses around them, but because they were putting out regular content and stuff like that, especially freelancers, and it was a way to update your readers, your audience, that you could grow on your own. That this column was coming out or this article was coming out, and I'm guessing that's kind of you were making all your money at that point from freelancing, so you probably weren't putting a ton of time into the newsletter. You were just kind of probably linking to your columns and just rounding up some news or something like that.
Yeah, I think my struggle from the beginning was I probably did put too much time into it, just because I wanted, I was excited about it and passionate about it, but certainly was not making any money in the beginning. I mean, I was just putting in my own time. Yeah, it started out, I kind of went back and forth. It took a while to feel out what the focus should be, how much original material there should be, how much linking there should be. I think in the earliest form, it always had some manner of original stuff that didn't appear anywhere else, but it did revolve around kind of the nucleus of it was whatever I was writing, online at Computerworld or wherever it was. So it would kind of expand from there and go a little broader. From the beginning, it had today the main primary newsletter format revolves around like 3 things to know this week, 3 things to try this week. The branding was different. It was like the 3 things to try weren't called that. The 3 things to know were 5 things to know. They were a lot longer, much too much information for everybody. But the kind of skeleton was there in the beginning. And then it was just a matter of refining and figuring out what worked, what didn't, and honing it from there.
Well, how did it find an audience? Did your editors let you plug it at the bottom of the column?
Yeah, the people really pretty much everywhere I write have always been really gracious about that and allowed me to plug it in the material. At that point, I've never been one with like a massive social media following, but there was some social media following that probably helped a little bit. And so, you come in with a little bit of an advantage when you're already being published somewhere, of course, as opposed to somebody who's just starting a newsletter out of nowhere and trying to make that their main thing. So I think I'd have to look back to confirm, but I want to say the first issue went out to 800 some people, which pretty decent. I certainly can't complain. I mean, that's a nice little audience for something that had never been published. But what I think I learned pretty quickly is whatever that advantage is, after they get the first issue, it kind of evaporates because you either win them over or you don't. I mean, if it's not interesting, people unsubscribe or stop paying attention or what have you. So it was nice to come in with that audience and to continue to be able to grow that audience over time as people read my stuff elsewhere, or saw it on Twitter, or whatever might have been going on at the time. But yeah, I mean, once they get in the door, that foot in the door, I think, is where the advantage ends. At that point, it still comes down to, are you giving them something that they like, that has value, that's enjoyable to read, pleasant to read, that's not a horrible format, all the stuff that anybody's going to have to figure out and do right in order to make it work.
Well, by that point, there are a ton of people writing about Android, but I'm guessing that you had some kind of advantage that you were there from the very beginning, that you had kind of built up credibility in this community when it was tiny. Do you think you benefited from that in terms of kind of quickly, because 800 to start off before you even launch a first issue, that's a lot. Most newsletters stop with a lot less than that. So how much do you think you benefit from, really taking Android seriously early and getting in there?
Oh, I think quite a bit. I mean, in the early days of Android, most publications, well, really no publications, had a dedicated column, section, person on that beat, whatever you want to call it. So, there were a few like independent, less traditional journalism background Android blogs, a handful of which are still around today that were out there. But in terms of like the traditional big name outlets, it was just kind of like a blurb in the newsfeed for most places. It wasn't a section of it or somebody was really focused on that. So I'd imagine that probably did go a long way. And, all advantage in people knowing you, whatever aside, I mean, I think the big advantage for me over time has just been the context, that something that happens today, I can contextualize having watched it so closely all this time. And, I also have written and continue to write about other Google associated areas, Chrome and Chrome OS, and even, getting into some of the apps like Gmail and Docs. So kind of being able to get that big picture perspective and analysis. And, particularly with Google, something will come up and suddenly say, wait a minute, Google did this exact same thing 5 years ago. Of course, anybody, especially nowadays, it's pretty easy to research and find stuff, but having that firsthand knowledge of having been there, having gone through it, I think that helps a lot. And it's a base of knowledge it would be very difficult to catch up on if you didn't do it all along.
So I saw this tweet months and months ago, but I just thought it was so brilliant. Is like 90% of being a good beat journalist is knowing exactly what to Google. So like, that you know in the back of your head that something happened 5 years ago that was very similar to this, and maybe you don't remember every single detail, but because it happened, to Google it and you can catch up on it very quickly. Whereas someone who's covering something for the first time, they don't have that kind of historical context. So a lot of like being a good beat journalist is just knowing where to look to find the information that's relevant today.
Oh, that's brilliantly said. And it amuses me to no end how often I research something and come across a story I wrote about.
Yeah, that you don't even remember.
5 years ago, 8 years ago, whatever. Sometimes I'm deliberately looking for it, where I know, okay, I remember vaguely covering this, and I'll search for like whatever topic plus my name, site, whatever. But sometimes I just stumble upon it, and you're reading it like, huh, who's this guy? This voice sounds, oh, that was me. 10 years later, you write so many things, it's just all kind of a blur, and you really don't remember the specifics of it. So that is very true.
Yeah, I've been writing on the internet for at least as long as you, and I've had that phenomena where I come across stuff I don't even remember writing while I'm doing research for an article that I'm currently doing. So you started off with 800 people. How quickly did it start, finding an audience? When did you start to think like, oh, wow, there's something real here that I need to kind of put a lot of focus on?
It grew pretty quick. I mean, especially in those early weeks, and it was always once a week, so it's a little bit of a different cadence than what a lot of people do with more frequent 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 times a week publications. But let's see. It started in 2018. As I went through 2019, it began taking more and more of my time. Early on, I had a little bit of like a supporter program, just like a Patreon page that people can sign up and support, which really I just started because people asked about it. And I thought, well, what the hell? If somebody wants to throw in a few bucks a month, I cover a little bit of the time. As things went on, there were a little bit of expenses here and there. And I figure at least maybe that'll balance things out. But it wasn't a big focus. They really just got sort of token gestures in return. There wasn't much to it. Pretty early on, I'd say maybe a few months in, I started feeling an obligation to give people who were supporting it something back. And so I started doing I called it Android Intelligence Platinum, a platinum edition of the newsletter that had some extra stuff in it. And that was really kind of all it was in the beginning. It still wasn't a lot, but at least something. But then more and more, that's more time you're putting into it. And so as I got through 2019, I realized that I was devoting a fair chunk of my work week. And as somebody who's, as you mentioned, I'm not on the staff anywhere. So, I'm getting paid for what I do. Suddenly, like a big part of my work week is going to something that I'm actually not getting paid for. And I mean, realistically, I was doing the same amount of work I was before. I was just squeezing a lot in and bleeding over into later hours and catching up in the evenings and all that. So as I got into those next couple of years, 2020, I started really thinking like, okay, this has got to soon start either being a bigger part of my actual income, or I've got to start scaling back. Like I've got to test the waters and see, does this have legs? Can this be a business? Can this make money and hold a role and earn its spot in my work week schedule? Or do I need to just figure out if maybe it's not going to work out? I need to spend less time. So 2021 was the first year where I decided I'm going to go all in. Well, kind of all in. I didn't give up all of my other stuff or much of my other stuff at that point, but I'm going to test it as a business. I really started focusing on, for the first time, bringing in sponsors. I kind of formalized what became a membership program and built more of a value package around it and started marketing it a little more deliberately and considered that my test year, that if that goes well, if by the end of that year I felt that could hold its own, then the next year I would scale back my external writing, make that more of my focus. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. By the end of 2021, I was very confident that had legs. It could support a big chunk of my income, my salary needs. And so 2022, for the first time, the balance shifted. And the majority of my income last year was from Android Intelligence, from my own independent publication and all the little pieces that have popped up around it. And I continue to write and still do continue to write on most of those same external publications. But it was the first time where that shifted and Android Intelligence was the big focus and the other stuff was kind of the side part of it, as opposed to, the exact opposite as it had been all along up till then.
So on the sponsorship side, who were you actually pitching sponsors, or did you do what I do, where I just kind of have a note in my thing? Here's my advertising page. Go read it and tell me what ads you want to book. And who were the sponsors that you were bringing in?
So it timed out in an interesting way for me. Right around the time, and let's see, I think this would have been 2021, if I remember correctly. Right around the time I was starting to work on sponsorships, a service called SwapStack was launching, and it's still around. I still use it. They're basically, it's evolved a little bit, but in its earliest, simplest form, it was kind of like a marketplace for people who want to sponsor newsletters to meet people who have newsletters, on a smaller level. Like they're not selling ads for Morning Brew or whatever, but it's just sort of like a self-serve. You meet people. At that point, it was mostly run through, and there's a website that you would use to kind of see who was there, but then you would interact with people on a Slack thing. And it was very low key. It's come a long way since then. At that point, it was casual. And so my earliest sponsors came from there. I believe the very first one, I'd have to look to be sure. There were a couple. 1440, which is a very big newsletter and continues to be a sponsor today. It has been a great partner. They were one of the, if not the earliest, one of the very earliest. Then we worked with a premium phone accessory company called Paracable, which was a pretty obvious match. 1440 was an interesting one because right off the bat, I wouldn't think, okay, a different newsletter about general news will work, but that turned out to be a brilliant match. So yeah, SwapStack early on was where a lot of the initial sponsors came from. But from the beginning, I kind of wanted to see what else was out there. So I just tried reaching out and thinking of who else might be an interesting fit and exploring. So pretty early, there were a fair amount of sponsors who were coming in from my own outreach as well. I never, interestingly enough, had much luck with doing the call out in the newsletter. I tried when I first started doing sponsorships. I don't think I ever got a single inquiry from that. And it may just be a nature of the audience. The people who are reading are just people who have Android phones. I mean, a lot of business people, yes, but not necessarily people who are looking to advertise to that audience. So
Hmm.
for me, it's always
So
been a combination of outreach and then some of those platforms.
So who's like the ideal sponsor? Is it someone who is who sells tools to the Android developer community? Is it like apps that are on Android where you're trying to get Android users to download and use your apps? Like like what kind of sponsors like are really kind of hit the sweet spot for your newsletter?
It's not so much developer stuff. There are developers who read the newsletter, but by and large, it's more of a average end user kind of crowd. It's very like plain English consumery kind of stuff. So what I found is there are a few different categories. First, definitely anything with like an Android connection. So the accessories. We worked for quite a while closely with D Brand, one of those premium case makers. Anything like that has a pretty clear and obvious connection that just works well. Same with the cable company. The cable company sounds like a whole different thing. The company that sells cables and charging accessories and that kind of stuff. So that works well. If there is something that's an app or a tool, that tends to do pretty well too. Interestingly enough, some of the biggest success stories have been tools that aren't specific to Android. What I like to always tell people is that like it's called Android intelligence. I think about it as a newsletter that's about productivity that just happens to be written for people who use Android. So I cover, Chrome, web stuff. Most people who have an Android phone are also using a computer. So a lot of the stuff that we've seen success with has been like a browser extension or a web-based photo editing app or, that kind of stuff. And then the third, so especially with like a productivity edge. So productivity tools or just interesting Android/computer related tools. And then the third one, like with 1440, has just been other newsletters that certainly don't have to be tech specific. 1440 has been a big one. We continue to work with them with the Morning Brew. Morning Brew has a sub brand called Emerging Tech Brew that's done pretty well. And then lots of other random, like some finance newsletters. We had a few of those that have done pretty well over a long period of time. So, it's the old thing. People who read newsletters like newsletters. And just because you're interested in Android, probably interested in other random things too. So it doesn't have to be just like tech stuff. Any newsletter that at least generally fits the demographic that's likely to resonate with the same sort of people usually has a pretty strong chance of doing well from what I've seen.
And you mentioned that you started your subscriptions out as kind of basically a free membership, didn't really offer much, but then you started to get serious about it. I'm guessing you moved off the Patreon to some kind of system that you could run a little bit more closely that integrated with your email service provider. So how much should you charge?
So the very beginning, it was there were tiers. I think it was like $1, $3, $5 a month, something like that, in the earliest incarnation of it. Once it moved onto my own platform, which from the beginning has been and continues to be Memberful, which just integrates very nicely and seamlessly into all the other pieces of my increasingly intricate puzzle here. At that point, it was a $5 a year, or I'm sorry, $5 a month or $55 a year setup, and that price stayed the same. Like I said in the beginning, I wasn't really looking at it from a business perspective, so I didn't change the price. I just left it, and people wanted to do it. Great. It was just sort of like, okay, this is starting to make a little money. That's nice little thing on the side. It wasn't until that point when I mentioned earlier, when I was really starting to position it as a business, that I started to really look at it, and what people were getting for that had just exponentially increased over the years. I mean, it went from being what we were talking about before, just a slightly expanded version of the same newsletter, to being a whole membership website. There's a podcast, there's a help desk, a forum section where people can talk to other members, where they can get one-on-one on-demand tech support. There are tons and tons of advanced resources and guides and a searchable tip database. I mean, it now also comes with like $119 worth of free premium apps and services. There's a lot going
Wow.
on. Yeah, but I hadn't changed the price that whole time. So I did what I know most people would probably advise heavily against, and did one massive jump. Now, it wasn't blind. I did go in, I did a lot of polling. I surveyed the existing members very carefully. And with almost no, very, very rare exception, everybody said, I would happily pay more than double what I'm paying now. It's crazy how little you're charging. And so I changed the price from $5 a month, $55 a year, to $30 a quarter or $95 a year, which is what it is still now. And
That's not too big. of a jump.
Yeah. So it worked out. I mean, it was a hefty jump, but what I tried to do to mitigate it is anyone who was a member, I tried to be very clear in the communication that, look, you've been here, many of you since the beginning, certainly since early on in this process. If you want to stick around and for whatever reason you can't justify that, just email me and we'll work something out. And the people who did, it's fine. We whatever it was, I kind of created a recurring discount so anybody who had been on board and couldn't justify that price could stay if they so chose. But for anyone new coming in, that's still what it continues to be. And also switching to the quarterly as opposed to monthly was a kind of deliberate thing, again, starting to look at it from a business perspective, and that it makes a little more sense. People can commit. Of course, there's still trial period, all that, but this way it's a little something to help reduce churn and all that fun stuff.
Yeah. It's in terms of like raising prices, like I was charging $50 a year and I just raised it to 100 because I have like such a bespoke, offering that I do these live office hours calls. And eventually once you reach a certain size with these calls, they start being a lot less interactive and stuff like that. So I need to raise the barrier to entry. But what I just did is I just grandfathered in people at what they were already paying, so they got rewarded for being in early, but then new people coming in would have to pay the increased price, and that way nobody could get pissed at me that all of a sudden their bill went up and stuff like that. So I wonder if
That's yeah.
more publishers and more creators should just do that. Like if they want to raise prices, fine, but just do like reward your original customer base and then just raise it for people coming in. So you mentioned this forum, and I'm seeing more and more creators and publishers do this where they, the benefit isn't always necessarily extra content, it's access to other enthusiasts within that same niche, which can be really powerful. I just published a profile on this Wednesday of this week of The Hustle, which launched this thing called Trends, which is a $300 a year subscription service. And one of the biggest benefits for that is access to this private Facebook group. In fact, there are people who subscribe just for the access to that. And that $300 is kind of like a barrier to entry to ensure that the people who actually get into that group are actually very serious entrepreneurs and business people. So what are you finding with that? Like yours is on Discord, right? So, and you said that it's almost like a help desk where people are kind of, and I found that with the Trends group that I profiled, that a lot of them are just using it for crowdsourcing answers to questions that they have with different tools and stuff like that. Is that how most of the people are using your Discord?
So it's actually discourse, which is
discourse.
A very
Sorry.
confusing distinction. Like the fact that these two community software. So yeah, discourse is more of like a traditional forum. What I really liked, well, I liked a few things about it. It integrates in natively and very seamlessly with Memberful, and just kind of fit into the whole package that I had created. And it's really customizable. So I was able to take what's kind of most of them you see, they all look the same. It sort of got its own look, but I was able to really dig in and not entirely myself. I know just enough like CSS and HTML to be dangerous, but with the help of some developers who are way smarter at that stuff, to really make it feel like one consistent piece of the membership site. So if you sign into the actual membership site, which is, at my domain, my web host, my WordPress installation, you don't even realize when you're clicking from that to the discourse, even though that's actually on a completely different server, completely different host, completely different operating system. Everything around it is different. It all looks and feels the same. There's consistent navigation. There's a progressive web app that you can install on a phone or a computer, and it looks and feels like you're in an app, and you don't even think about the fact that you're actually going to a completely different service. But yeah, in terms of what it's used for, it's been interesting. It's been kind of a 50-50 mix for me, I would estimate, so one section of that is called the Platinum Help Desk, and that's where anyone can post a question. That was something I kind of did before, just a little more casually. As part of the membership, I would say, you can email me anytime. Ask me whatever you want. I'll help you with whatever it is, as far as I can. And again, just sort of having this foundation of knowledge, there's a lot of stuff that if someone has a super, super technical need, I'm not going to be able to help develop their app. But with the average people, 9 times out of 10, it's usually something I can help troubleshoot. So that evolved into the Platinum Help Desk. And there's a fair amount that happens there, both from kind of the forum regulars and people who are members, but not in the forum too often. We'll just show up and ask a question here and there. And what's been interesting about that is that whereas in the early days, it'd be a one-on-one email, this has evolved to a point where, I still jump in frequently and answer a lot of the questions. I'm always there, but other people jump in too. And that's great. And it's actually enriched it in a way that, there are times where maybe someone's asking for a creative solution, like, oh, I want to, not just like a black and white, how do I do X, but I want to set up an automation to help me do this. And what can I, and maybe I come up with something that's one way to do it, but then someone else says, ooh, I saw this other app or this whatever smart device that I picked up the other day and would be perfect for that. So it brings a much more diverse kind of perspective that's, sheer effort aside, has just made it a lot more of an interesting offering. But in addition to that, there is just really kind of the more traditional community part of it, where there's I'd say smaller but very tight knit group within the Platinum membership who it's just kind of become the hangout. And for me too, especially nowadays with Twitter being what it is, social media being what it is, it's kind of like I've realized I don't really feel like I need that. I mean, yeah, there's a different from marketing and all that, of course, being in a public place has its value, but I feel like kind of my social media home has become the Platinum community. And I think for a lot of the people, well, I know because a lot of people have expressed that they feel that way too, which is kind of cool. Starting this out, it was a gamble. The fear that I had, I was petrified. I'm going to start this, have this forum, and no one's going to be posting anything. It's just going to be me posting stuff. And, the painfully embarrassing, like, call for engagement and no one answers. And thankfully, it was the first time that anyone in the membership saw anyone else in the membership. Before, it was very one directional. They saw me, I saw them. And they all met each other, and it was just kind of like this natural group of people who got along. And with new people coming in over time, and the people who get it and love it, and then the people who are members and don't get into it, whatever, they enjoy the other stuff, and that's fine too.
How much of it is like self-propelled now? Like, could you step away for a week and then come back and see that everybody's just been having a grand old time and getting a lot of value out of it without you there?
Yeah, so it's interesting you ask. I just, for the first time in as long as I can remember, did that. The week between Christmas and New Year's, we took our first, going anywhere trip in however many years since pre-pandemic, and our first time ever getting on an airplane with our kids who were still fairly young. And, of course, I take weeks off here and there, but I usually kind of like take weeks off, but I'll check in and, sort of still be present. I'm not publishing stuff, but especially with like the forum, I'll answer stuff. This was the first time where I said, all right, from whatever it was, December 24th through whatever day I came back, the 1st or something, 2nd, I'm not looking at anything. If all hell breaks loose and the thing melts down, I had my laptop, I was prepared, but otherwise, yeah. And it was a funny thing. I felt kind of like a parent where the child, forming the child was like,
oh, off to college.
Baby's all grown up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was beautiful. I came back and even, just general chit chat, but then even some Q&A stuff. Something would come up and like 5 other people would jump in and everyone would work through it. And I posted a response on that. Like, I'm almost in tears looking at this. It's like seeing this thing. It's kind of a funny thing because both it's awesome and incredible that it's become that. And then I'm also like, maybe I'm not even needed here anymore, which I don't think is the case, but it's an interesting dual mix of emotions on that front. So yeah, that's been really cool to see.
So I saw on your website that you launched some kind of online course. What's the deal behind that?
So there are actually 3 total. There were 2 that have been out for a while that aren't promoted. Well, they're promoted in a different way. There are 2 that I've had for a while that are purely, they're totally free. They're just lead magnets rather. And so they're just something that I found to be pretty effective as a promotional tool to get people in. Certain kind of person is going to hear newsletter and be interested. A certain kind of person just isn't. And to offer a course, so one of them is called the Android Shortcut Super Course. And it's a 7-day email thing. You get one each day, teaching you all sorts of little known, hidden, tucked away tips and tricks and ways to save time and get around Android faster. So it's an easier thing for a lot of people to wrap their head around. Hey, I'm going to get 7 days of cool knowledge. It's more of a finite kind of thing. And then at the end of that, they're invited to stick around. You'll get your first newsletter issue next Friday. Here's what you'll find out. And of course, it's easy to unsubscribe. We're not deceiving anybody, but the vast majority of people stick around, end up liking it. The new one that launched that's promoted a little more prominently on the website is the first premium paid course that I've ever done. And it was something that I also wasn't really sure what to expect going into it because it was just uncharted territory. But I thought it'd be an interesting thing to experiment with and see that perhaps there are certain people who might not pay $95 a year or $15 a quarter, that might not want an ongoing thing or feel like they need it or whatever the case might be, but might say, ooh, this one-time deal actually does appeal to me, and I'd be willing to pay a smaller amount to get that. And then also I kind of hedge my bets with it. So at the end of that, the course costs $20 one time. You do it. It's a week. It's really in depth. It's called the Android Photography Masterclass. You go through it and get all sorts of detailed info about how to specific stuff, like both broad, kind of like conceptual, how to take better pictures from a photography perspective, but then also super specific. Okay, you've got a Pixel phone, you've got a Samsung phone. Here are lots of little things you can change and lots of little features you should find, and photo editing, and just everything. So at the end of it, there's also an offer that credit, you pay $20, that credit and an extra $10 can go toward the platinum membership if you decide you want to go forward. So it's kind of served two purposes, both just a new venue for sharing information at a level of depth that I wouldn't really be able to do elsewhere, and a way to bring people in as paying customers who might not otherwise have been, but then also to ultimately bring some of those people on the path into full-fledged membership if they so choose at the end. So far it's been great, and it's been every bit more successful than I would have even anticipated. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think there is this desire from some people for one-off payments. They're against getting locked into some kind of like regular recurring payment on their credit card. I get these emails sometimes, I'm sure you did too, and maybe this is what kind of spurred you to create it, is like, I want to support you in some way. I just don't want to like pay a subscription. Is there some other way? And I have experimented with like publishing like PDF ebooks and stuff like that, but then I kind of abandoned that because I focused on other things. But yeah, it is something that I think a lot of creators need to think about, is like, how do you sell information products that are maybe just repackaging in a lot of sense what you're already doing elsewhere, and put it somewhere where people can buy it, and you'd be surprised like how many people actually want that thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting bit of diversification, if nothing else. And we're not talking like hundreds and hundreds of dollars, but a handful of people do it, and it's just kind of the steady trickling in effect that, again, just kind of makes it more of a viable business and allows you to devote your time to doing it. I've gotten that same question too, where it's like, is there a tip or donation? And I don't know. I've always felt really awkward about that. I don't want someone to just make a donation. And I think a lot of it's coming from a traditional journalism background too, and it's like, if someone's going to pay me, I want to be doing a service. The line between journalism and business is always inherently a little awkward. And I think all of us who do this feel slightly uncomfortable with it. But the donation thing, I could never wrap my head around. And so, yeah, this was a way where now when someone sends me that message, I can be like, well, hey, if you want to spend $20 on this, you'll get a really cool course. And that's a great way to support me. And hopefully you'll gain something from it as well.
Yeah. So in 2021, you decided, I'm going to take this seriously, see if I can turn this into a real business. You said 2022 is when you kind of made up the majority of your income. Have you started dialing back the freelance work that you're doing?
Yeah. So 2022, there was a definite shift. I dialed it back pretty substantially. So, I mean, just for like a couple of examples, I used to write roughly one feature story a month for Fast Company. As of 2022, I'm doing it every other month. So, I mean, cutting it literally in half. Same Computerworld, my feature work was basically cut in half in a similar way. And even the columns that I'm writing, which are under the Android Intelligence brand, scaled back significantly. And that's probably something that I'll continue to adjust over time. I mean, at this point, I'm basically still in that same setup where I'm doing a little bit of both. But, as I guess is probably a good thing, I definitely feel more and more like my time is getting stretched thin. And it's like, okay, I've got this to do. And it's a challenge because I genuinely enjoy doing both. And I like doing the traditional writing. And, writing a feature story is a very different kind of challenge, a creative challenge, than writing a newsletter or like a how-to guide or what have you. So it's always a balance I'm trying to figure out. But yeah, I would probably say, in terms of time, the newsletter and everything around it, probably like 75% or so of my work week is probably devoted to that. And I mean, it does also end up being something that bleeds into, like with the forum kind of thing. It's something where sometimes at night I'll just kind of, scroll around and look at something and answer something. So it's definitely the majority as of last year, without a doubt.
So you've been freelancing since 2008. Like freelancers are their own type of entrepreneur. So you've been an entrepreneur since 2008. But like running your own business, media business, it's a different kind of business than being a freelancer. It's technically, I mean, you own your audience, you have a direct connection to it. It's technically infinitely scalable, whereas like freelance can only scale, based on how much they're willing to pay you and how many hours you can work. What are the things you like about running your own media business versus, writing for other people's businesses?
I think, and I've just really clued into this very recently, like in the last few months, give or take. I think I can identify a lot with what you hear about with kind of like the entrepreneur bug. I think I've always had a little bit of that, and this has allowed me to sort of flex that creative muscle. I enjoy the act of creating something and building, a virtual environment and coming up with products and ideas and how to present them. So I think it's been an interesting creative outlet. I mean, like a lot of us in this field, I tend to get bored. And so this has been sort of like a new diversion of, oh, this is something fun and different and a different way to do it. Um, I think even the business part of it, for me, that's been the biggest challenge because I didn't go to business school. I didn't come from a business background. So it's been interesting to try to wrap my head around different pieces of that and find ways to do it that make sense and are effective and feel comfortable and feel right to me. I'd also say that's been the biggest challenge. I mean, I hate doing ad sales. It's not me. It's not what I do well. It's not what I know. I have no background in that. So it's been the biggest challenge. And I think also probably in a way, the biggest creative pleasure just because it's so different and so new and fun to come up with. I think too, having complete control of everything is just a delight that I never get tired of. Because no matter how much you love a publication, every traditional publication, at some point, to some degree, things are out of your control. I mean, even if it's you have editors you trust, et cetera, still, you might not like the design. You might not like all the ads that are popping up everywhere or
The
the
autoplay
colors.
video or whatever.
Yeah, and I won't deliberately call out any specific publisher, but I think most publishers out there, we all know the deal. We're pretty brutal, and they're doing what they have to do to survive. It's a business, but there is something nice to being able to have end-to-end control that, like the newsletter I send out, look exactly the way I want, and whatever compromises might be there in terms of ads, I don't feel like it's going too far. I feel like it's legible. If someone says, "Hey, what if the website, like on the platinum membership side, for instance, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this?" I can just be like, yeah, and just go down and do it, or hire a developer to do it, or whatever the case might be. So I think I take a lot of pleasure in being able to flex that freedom and that level of control after all the years of, for better and for worse, like submitting it into someone else's environment, and you kind of give it up at that point.
So looking a few years down the road, if you continue to scale and build the business, who do you think what would you want to do next? Like I talk to some creators and they always like, I want to hire operational people, someone who can help behind the scenes, whether it's ad sales or, a chief of staff or something like that. And then other creators, they go the other route. Like I want to hire more content creators so I can scale out the audience, which will then, grow the business that way. What do you, and they want to be more like operate like media companies rather than, being kind of like the single focus of the site. Which way do you kind of tend towards? Like if let's say you had an extra, 50K to play with a year to hire a contractor or something to help you with something, would you hire someone on the operational side, or would it be, on the bringing in other writers to expand what you're covering?
I think probably operational first and then content after. So I will say I've had, and this started with the 2022 kind of expansion. I've had a part-time kind of like operations person, operations coordinator is the official title, who's been helping with a lot of logistical things for a while. And then the first full-time employee in 2022, somebody heading up marketing and partnerships and taking over a lot of that, which again, marketing's another area. I come from a marketing background. I can write, but that's kind of its own art that is one that I've just sort of figured out and I don't consider myself an expert in. So I think looking forward, I'd love to do a little bit more of both. I think there's a lot of room to bring in logistical help and people who are experts in areas that I'm not, that I'm kind of winging it. I mean, ad sales is the perfect one. Like I can wing it at a certain point, but if this were to grow at a certain level, I'm quickly going to be, out of my league, which I already feel like I am to a certain degree. But, as things grow, I think that's an area where I would love to have somebody who is really a professional in that area and knows that inside out and could take that over. But yeah, I mean, beyond that, content wise too, I don't see myself completely stepping away and not doing what I'm doing now. But I think there's some interesting opportunities and some things that I'm kind of pursuing in early stages now where things could expand from what they are in different ways and address different markets, different audiences, maybe some broader subject areas, and kind of expand the brand a little bit. I mean, it's never going to be Morning Brew or The Verge or whatever, but kind of keeping in the independent spirit and the vibe of what it is, but finding ways that can reach different audiences or areas, or maybe something that applies a little more to like the enterprise, or something that branches out from Android and covers other areas like vaguely related but separate areas of tech that maybe I bleed over into but would make more sense as like a separate sister publication kind of alongside. So yeah, that's definitely stuff that's high on my mind, and something I'd like to see happen in the next couple of years as things keep moving forward, hopefully.
Okay, JR, well, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
So the newsletter itself is Android Intelligence, androidintel.net. That's really the best place. I stepped back a bit from Twitter for the moment. I've been exploring other places. I am over on Mastodon as well, on the Twit feed there. It's at jr@twit.social. But really, the newsletter is and continues to be where the bulk of my efforts go. So that's the best place to find me.
Yeah, Mastodon is really screwing up our ability to just like throw out a handle that's easy to remember.
Yeah, it is not at all simple. And some of them are worse than others. I mean, some of those things have really long names, and you got like the @ at the front and the @ in the middle. And
yeah,
I don't know. It's been an interesting community. I mean, we'll see how it develops over time. But are you on it as well? Yeah, I think you are. I think I follow you.
Yeah, I am on it, but I mean, I kind of just cross post stuff to it, but I can't say that I spend a ton of time on it.
Yeah, it feels like we're sort of in a transitional phase with that, I guess. We'll see what shakes out and what's still around, or, dominating the conversation in another 6 months, a year.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.